This panel is on the dual question, is Machiavelli a civic humanist or a figure of the Renaissance? And our panelists are James Hankins of Harvard, John McCormick of Chicago, Eric Nelson of Harvard, and Paul Rahe of Hillsdale. If there's no objection, we can go in that order.
Sure, alphabetical order, that's fine. Good, so I'm just going to leap right in because we don't have too much time. I hope those of you who are drinking the Starbucks coffee realize you have to leave your firearms outside. Right, you're probably not following the news there. Okay, I'm going to get into civic humanism question. This term, as is well known, was invented, I believe, in 1925 by the German historian Hans Baron, who was a student of Friedrich Meinecke, one of the great Machiavelli scholars. Baron's term in German was bürgerlicher Humanismus, which, as Donald Kelly, I think, remarked, would not have done so well in the Anglo-Saxon world had it been translated bourgeois humanism. He was lucky it was translated civic humanism. In any case, the point of the term in Baron's usage was to correct a common misperception of humanism that prevailed in Baron's time, derived ultimately, I think, from Burckhardt, that the humanists were rootless literati who traveled from court to court. They had no interest in politics, no commitment to any political ideology. They wrote in Latin. Their imitation of ancient authors made them unoriginal, unserious, and unread. As one historian at the time said, having nothing to say, they said it interminably. So this is sort of the people didn't put much stock in humanists as political theorists. Baron argued principally on the basis of his studies of Leonardo Bruni that an important current of thought within the humanists was in fact committed to Republican ideology. That this civic humanist ideology, as he called it, represented a reversal of feudal otherworldly ideology supposedly inherited from the Middle Ages. The civic humanists not only praised Republican government, but placed a positive value on wealth and commerce, as against a supposed medieval bias towards agriculture and monastic poverty. They praised family life as against monastic belittling of the married state. They found in the defense of the city-state a non-religious justification for military virtue, and in general valued participation in politics, the active life, over the contemplative, the public service in this life, as against a medieval outlook that supposedly subordinated the temporary to the eternal and politics to the salvation of souls. So the civic humanists represented for Baron an important stage in the history of secularization, at least in one sense of that term. As my insistent repetition of the word supposedly will give away, most of this picture is no longer accepted. Baron himself started correcting it in the 1950s. In particular, Baron's presentation of medieval and feudal ideals in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s is now recognized as a caricature. And in general, the ideology he described is now seen to be rooted in the popular communes of the 13th century and not as a result of some crisis around 1400. However, I don't want to spend my time this morning on the history of Renaissance humanist historiography, which is well known. Instead, I want to give my own account of humanist political thought before Machiavelli, which will be a kind of praegustatio of a book that I'm finishing, which began as the Carlisle Lectures at Oxford in 2010. And then I'm going to turn to Machiavelli and discuss his relationship to humanist political thought of the Quattrocento, which I prefer to describe as neoclassical rather than civic humanist, for reasons I'll explain. In fact, my view is that Machiavelli thoroughly and quite intentionally subverts neoclassical politics in the humanist tradition. He's a Samson determined to bring crashing down the twin columns upholding humanist political thought, namely philosophical virtue ethics and the humanist ideal of rule by a classically educated elite. So the title of my book is The Politics of Virtue, which gives, I hope, some notion of my emphasis. I'm trying to decenter Republican liberty as the central theme of humanist political thought, and instead emphasize what I call virtue politics on the analogy of virtue ethics, that is to say, a politics emphasizing the character, the moral character of the ruling class, above questions of legitimacy, of origins, and regime. As I argued in an article in Political Theory published in 2010, the whole notion of Renaissance republicanism tends to be misconceived, mostly because of inattention to the meaning of the word res publica in the period. The word didn't acquire its modern meaning of non-monarchical republic until around the middle of the 15th century. It did not, in other words, specify a constitutional form until Leonardo Bruni and other humanists began using it in the 1440s as a translation for Aristotle's virtuous popular regime, one of the philosopher Aristotle's three good regimes, which Aristotle confusingly names politeia. There's a handout, by the way, if you didn't get it, which shows you the difference between the way the Middle Ages translated Aristotle's political constitutional terminology and the way Bruni did. And it's confusing because politeia is used in two senses in Aristotle. There's what I call specific and generic. Specific is the virtuous popular regime. Generic is for any regime whatsoever. So generically, politeia means the formal constitutive characteristics of any polity, analogous to physis, the physis of a living thing. So with misguided consistency, Bruni also translated generic polity using the word res publica. This was misguided because res publica is in key respects a poor translation for politeia. The Romans never used res publica to indicate a particular kind of constitution, for example, a non-monarchical or polyarchic constitution, still less a virtuous popular regime. Moreover, politeia in Greek could be a neutral analytical term, but res publica in Latin was freighted with positive moral connotations. It meant not only the state, but a good state, a state that respects the free status of its citizens, the common good, that treats citizens as equal under law, and not despotically as slaves. So it's a term of praise, a persuasive definition in William Connolly's sense. Its lexical opposite is not monarchy, but tyranny. So res publica or tyranny, but not res publica monarchy. You can have a monarchical republic in Roman, in Latin terminology. The point, I think, is an important one because the idea of res publica, with its reminder of the glorious Roman past, with its connotations of just government for the sake of the citizen body as a whole, government by virtuous rulers and magistrates, of government that valued liberty and ensured it through observance of law and constitutional propriety, this Roman conception of res publica became a kind of linguistic marker in humanistic literature. The luminous word res publica all by itself evoked the great idealistic project of the Renaissance, the revival of antiquity, the end of the Middle Age, as it touched on matters political. But as I argue in my book, Republican thought in the Renaissance was not limited to republics in the modern sense of the word, i.e. regimes recognizing the will of the people as the ultimate source of sovereignty, nor was civic humanism or vivere civile confined to the oligarchic regimes that came to refer to themselves as republics in the course of the 15th century. It's true that by the time of Machiavelli, and particularly in Machiavelli's own political vocabulary, the word res publica, thanks mostly to Bruni and Francesco Patrizzi of Siena and Donato Acciaiuoli, wrote the most important commentary on the politics, had acquired a secondary meaning, indicating a popular form of government as opposed to princely. Machiavelli famously, in the very first chapter of The Prince, contrasted republics with principalities, as did many other Renaissance writers from the 1440s onward. But the classical usage of res publica as any virtuous state that respects the common good and citizen liberties remained current, and the word could be used to designate any type of regime, whether kingly, aristocratic, or popular. So Renaissance humanists worked for many different types of regime. They brought their neoclassical ideals of politics to bear in many different political contexts. So if we are to use the term Renaissance republicanism, we should remember that it includes princely republics and aristocratic republics, as well as popular republics. This is one reason I don't like civic humanism, because most people that means republic in our sense, which is non-monarchical government. That's why I prefer neoclassical, because first of all, Quentin Skinner, of course, famously at one point wanted to change civic humanism for neo-Roman. But that's not quite, I don't think that's accurate, because many of the ideas that are being revived are in fact Greek. I think the most important ideas that are being revived are Greek. So to avoid that, I call it neoclassical. So this is one major point I'd like to make, that Renaissance republicanism was not regime-specific, and the neoclassical political thought of the humanists was much more interested in the virtue of governors than in the form of government. This leads to my second point, namely the centrality of virtue to humanist political thought and the relative unimportance of what Barron called Republican liberty. Liberty of popular regimes is praised by some humanists, including important ones like Bruni, but this is a minority view overall. It tends to be expressed principally in propagandistic contexts like the Laudatio Florentinae Orbis. But all humanist political theorists are centrally concerned with the virtue of rulers and the ruling class. The theme of virtue is ubiquitous, as we know in humanist ethical writers, but it's also true in humanist political writings, equally pervasive there. The humanists saw virtue in the ruling class as the key to better government and a cure for corruption. They cared much less than their medieval predecessors about the type of regime a state embraced or its constitutional form. It's not too much to say, I believe the humanist politics is the politics of virtue. Now, the primacy of virtue in humanist political thought had a lot to do, in my opinion, with the contemporary problems of legitimacy and a broad change in strategies of legitimation employed by 15th century rulers. Lords and oligarchs with defective titles to rule in the 14th century had availed themselves of a variety of legitimation techniques. For example, managed communal elections, where they control the pulling out of names, staged ceremonies of acclamation, loyalty oaths, the co-optation of guild leadership, usually the corruption of guild leadership, acquisition of imperial and papal vicariates, purchase of titles of nobility, invented claims to high descent, and so on. The Venetians' favorite tactic was to march the subject population into the piazza and then surround it with their soldiers and then have them acclaim the new Venetian lords of whatever small town in Dalmatia they were taking over that week. So these tactics of sort of manufactured legitimation continue into the Quattrocento, but they're regarded with increasing cynicism and distrust. The humanist offered to supplement legalistic forms of legitimation with a different type of claim, the claim that a ruler was virtuous and that his rule was legitimate precisely because it was virtuous, just, moderate, frugal, merciful, and respected the liberties and patrimonies of citizens. The humanists, in their roles as teachers, officials, and advisors, insisted everywhere that virtue was itself both a necessary and sufficient title to rule. This claim dovetailed nicely with the humanists' new claim that classical education was a training in virtue and eloquence, suitable for future statesmen and their humanist advisors. Eloquence was important as the trumpet of virtue. It was an instrument of persuasion. It made men want to be virtuous by praising good conduct and character and blaming bad in the most lively colors. So rhetoric is a substitute for coercion. In modern terms, humanist eloquence was meant as a kind of social technology, incentivizing good behavior through the use of praise and blame, as opposed to repressing bad behavior by using the coercive powers of government. To use Albert Hirschman's analytical framework, the humanists aimed to neutralize corrupt passions and appetites, the desire for personal gain or for revenge, by stimulating a countervailing passion, the desire for honor and admiration from the community. This could be done by immersing future statesmen in classical history, poetry, and moral philosophy, a moral universe where the highest praise and highest rewards are lavished on public servants, and by involving the political class in a Celestian competition in virtue. The humanists understood that the classical ideal of virtue depended on cultivating a certain sense of self, that one is the kind of person that doesn't do certain things, that one's dignity and honor within a community depend on not acting or not being seen to act out of self-interest, catering to one's own appetites, but on serving the community. And if you look at some of the passages on the handout, particularly the last one by Bruni, you'll see some of these ideas in contemporary texts. The humanist ideal of virtue comes from classical history and philosophy, especially from what Cicero called the Socratic philosophy of Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle, supplemented by the teachings of the Stoics. Aristotle's Ethics, Cicero's De Officiis, and Livy's History of Rome were the most important texts, but there are many others. Central is the idea of rational control, that the passions and appetites in moderation are good, but need to be measured out in appropriate ratios by reason. The man ruled by reason was the man of virtue. For Aristotle, one test of whether reason was acting correctly was whether the whole person, not just one faculty or aspect, was flourishing. The same analysis of the whole and the part applied to the city. Reason in the person of the virtuous and wise ruler needed to serve the whole polity, doing what was appropriate for each part to flourish and not favoring one part over another. The humanist politics of virtue implies various subversions, both implicit and explicit, but only some of these are theoretically developed. Implicitly, the humanists reject Augustine's view that classical virtue was too weak and benighted to provide the basis for a good polity. You probably all remember the famous passages in Book 19 of the City of God where Augustine proves that, to his satisfaction, that classical virtue is ineffective. But I don't have time to go into that, but it's one of the major differences between humanist political theory and scholastic political theory, that the humanists blank out Augustine, essentially. They simply ignore him. Explicitly subverted is the egalitarian ideology of the late medieval commune, the politics of the guilds in places like Florence, Siena, and Lucca. The humanists, in contrast to the egalitarianism of the medieval Italian commune, became champions of meritocracy. This theme is mostly developed in their numerous treatises on true nobility, a genre almost synonymous with humanism. Paul Oscar Christeller, the great authority on humanist literature, who did the great catalog of all the humanist literature at Iter Italicum, says somewhere that the most common humanist genre is the treatises on nobility. So this is a genre very closely associated with humanism. It's a genre with a message. It's striking that, with only one or two exceptions, the humanists are overwhelmingly on the side of virtue as the primary, or more often the only, criterion of true nobility. Thanks to humanist influence, the political classes of the Italian city-states and the Italian courts came to accept the idea that a classical education was a training in virtue, and that virtue enhanced not only one's personal distinction, but also buttressed one's claims to exercise political power. I put a couple examples on your sheet of this De Nobilitate literature. Since doing that sheet, I found another one just this morning in De Nobilitate treatise by Galateo, where he actually says the only way to be noble is to have a classical education, which I quite like, having had a classical education. But I don't know that would be widely accepted today. But it gives you the flavor of the close connection between the educational theories of the humanists and their politics. All right, the politics of virtue thus challenged and in part undermined the whole idea of hereditary privilege, a theme that links the humanists with Republicans of the 18th century. Humanist views on true nobility questioned the basis of inherited social rank and therefore a political hierarchy based on descent, and led them to propose an alternative justification for political rule, namely virtue and education, and the wisdom that's supposed to come from that. We have to remember that prudence always is one of the virtues. The humanist goal was, again, to open up the ranks of the political elite to those who were truly virtuous, not merely noble by descent, and to force noblemen to compete for power on the terrain of virtue. For some humanists, even merchants and tradesmen could and should participate in government, provided they were virtuous. Virtuous is not just for aristocrats and princes and people who are already wealthy. This is something Francesco Patrizzi of Siena says in his very famous treatise he has two treatises actually, one on princely education and one on republican education. The need for princes and elites to acquire virtue was, to be sure, the central theme of the Mirror of Princes literature, which goes back to the early Middle Ages. What's new is the idea of meritocracy, that virtuous character was not merely desirable in rulers, but a condition of exercising power. Okay, I'm going to come to Machiavelli finally. I'll end with him. I've advanced the claim that Machiavelli's political thought can't be seen as a continuation or a variation or even a radicalization of humanist tradition. It's a view sometimes attributed to the so-called Cambridge School. Instead, it constituted a subversion of the central premises of the politics of virtue. This is because Machiavelli rejects the Greek philosopher's solution to political instability and infelicity, which is to create a political elite consisting of the wise and the virtuous. For Machiavelli, a republic dominated by an elite can achieve stability and longevity, but it won't be powerful, which is the primary goal of Machiavellian political science. His great historical model is Rome, a republic for expansion, not Sparta or Venice, modern Venice, which were merely republics for preservation. Machiavelli also famously believes that political rationality and traditional moral virtue are heteronymous, that to be good morally is not necessarily good for a state or a prince. And of course, he's dubious about any political philosophy that relies on the possibility of improving traditional morality, which all the humanists thought they were doing. He has no more faith in human goodness than Augustine, possibly less. Machiavelli's view thus represents a fundamental challenge to classical political philosophy, and one that is inimical to any politics of virtue. It was his separation of political rationality from traditional morality that enforced Machiavelli's redefinition of virtue. Virtù in Machiavelli's lexicon acquires the meaning of any human quality that made for effective political power. Malicious behavior he tends to assimilate to weakness. It's how men behave when the political system is poorly organized, when there are no roots to power for men of virtue in his sense of the word. Machiavelli is also hostile to the humanist goal of virtuous elite because he's a populist. He served the most populist of all Florentine regimes since the 14th century, the Soderini regime. He, to some extent, is identified with their politics. This is not to say that Machiavelli had some deep ideological commitment to democracy or popular government based on an idea of human dignity or some other moral criterion. Maybe you would disagree with that. He did not. He was a populist above all because he believed the secret of Rome's expansive power, its mighty empire, lay in its virtuous people, its virtuous commoners, the plebs. The men who flocked in great numbers to fill its armies knew how to master fortune and were willing to sacrifice themselves for the state. They were loyal and free and masculine and not slavish. This was because Rome's constitution had evolved in such a way as to allow her people to seek their own self-interest, security, prosperity, and freedom as against that of the patrician class, that they had tumults. Freedom, too, for Machiavelli was a word in need of redefinition. For the humanists, as for the ancient philosophers, freedom was not something natural to all men. It was an achieved character trait. It was the reward of virtue, a state of mind that supervened when reason ruled the passions and appetites. The opposite of liberty for many humanists is license. Okay, the only treatise that's actually written on liberty in the Renaissance by Alemanno Rinuccini, 1472, defines liberty in this way. It's the opposite. It's rational control. For Machiavelli, the desire for liberty was a natural passion whose embers could be found burning in all men. Those embers could be inflamed and exploited by clever statesmen so as to enhance the power of the state. If the correct modi e ordini were instituted, the passion for liberty could be built into a bonfire of bellico virtus, of warlike virtue, that would transform a city-state into a great empire. To most historians of political theory today, Machiavelli, with his consequentialist power politics and his proto-scientific mode of analysis, separating fact from value, has inevitably seemed far more modern than the humanist. The humanist confidence in the ability of individuals and polities to better themselves by acquiring virtue seems by comparison all too naive, and Machiavelli was among the most effective in mocking its naivete. Yet it does seem to me, taking a longer view forward in time, through early modern utopianism, modern progressive thought, to all modern political theories that hold out hope for the betterment of the human condition via education, that the humanists too have some claim to be among the founders of modern politics. And if one recognizes with Pareto that all government means rule by an elite, if one believes that the primary function of government is to provide justice and not to subdue other peoples or to encourage license in one's own citizenship, then humanist political thought might even be turn out to seem preferable in some ways to the Machiavellian style of politics so ubiquitous in the modern world. Okay.
Thank you. John?
Well, I want to thank Harvey for the generous invitation to attend this conference, and thank Andy and Anna for their hospitality and their arrangements. In my estimation, Machiavelli is not a Renaissance civic humanist in at least one fundamental respect. He demonstrates that corrupt republics must be reformed by princely figures reminiscent of ancient Greek tyrants. On the contrary, the civic republicans of Machiavelli's day, following Cicero, hoped that more conservative princely figures would assume the task of, quote-unquote, setting right republics beset by corruption and social strife. For example, so-called fathers of their country, like Furius Camillus, Caesar Augustus, and Cosimo de' Medici, or the Rector Republicae of Cicero's literary imagination, Scipio Africanus the Younger. Most civic humanists hoped that a patrician, quote-unquote, first citizen would step forth to settle the social crises of their cities, doing so with either equanimity toward all classes or more preferably in ways that advantaged their republic's nobilities. Machiavelli is the only, quote-unquote, republican who exalts the ancient Greek tyrant as the model reformer of corrupt civic orders. Figures like Hiero of Syracuse, Agathocles the Sicilian, the Spartans, Cleomenes and Nabis, and Clearchus of Heraclea. If one were to draw an ideal type based on historical accounts of such individuals, and on Machiavelli's own description of them, the perfect Republican reformer would do all of the following: crush the nobility and distribute its wealth to the common people, eliminate all reliance on mercenary arms, greatly expand the ranks of citizen soldiers, especially by freeing slaves to do so, and finally, manipulate diplomatic alliances so as to reduce external threats posed by more powerful foreign empires. In Machiavelli's estimation, the conservative Ciceronian humanist type of Republican reformer, typified in his day by the Medici, usually takes the opposite course. He disarms common citizens, exacerbates their status as mere clients of their city's nobles or senators, and leaves their polity vulnerable to domination by foreign powers. Quentin Skinner is, of course, the most famous exponent of the idea that Machiavelli is, first and foremost, a civic humanist. Skinner and formidable students, such as Peter Stacy and others, like Maurizio Veroli, insist that Machiavelli is a faithful civic humanist because he devotes his most important work, the Discourses, exclusively to the cause of promoting republics over principalities. In particular, Skinnerians attempt to confine Machiavelli's endorsement of unilateral, often violent and criminal, behavior to the prince, and they work strenuously to cast the Discourses as a work in which political action, including action tending toward violence and coercion, occurs exclusively within legally circumscribed bounds. I don't know if Skinner has responded to the work of my fellow panelists, Jim Hankins and Eric Nelson, who have located the rise of quote-unquote exclusivist republicanism to a much later era than the Italian Renaissance. Hankins and Nelson have shown that there was greater fluidity than Skinner acknowledges between understandings of principalities and republics in virtually all traditional Republican thinkers, at least up until the Dutch and English appropriations of Hebraic republicanism and up until the dogmatic anti-monarchism of the American and French revolutionaries. In any case, history aside, the very text of Machiavelli's Discourses would seem to pose an insurmountable problem for Skinner. As Leo Strauss noted over half a century ago, the Discourses offers advice not only to princes, but quite explicitly to tyrants. For instance, in Discorso 116, Machiavelli advises individuals who wish to pursue, quote, the way of freedom, unquote, to emulate Lucius Brutus, and those who wish to pursue, quote unquote, the way of tyranny, to imitate Clearchus of Heraclea. Brutus, quite famously, oversaw the trial and execution of his sons who conspired to overthrow the fledgling Roman Republic, reinstate the Tarquin monarchy, and reassert aristocratic privilege in the city. But Machiavelli invokes the far less well-known example of Clearchus to instruct would-be tyrants on the best means of achieving their ends. Clearchus murders the entire nobility of Heraclea after they made him prince. Machiavelli reiterates this lesson in Book 3 when he writes, quote, "Whoever establishes a tyranny and does not kill Brutus, and whoever establishes a free state and does not kill the sons of Brutus, maintains himself only for a very short time," unquote. Lucius Brutus's republic was long-lived because he killed his treacherous sons. Julius Caesar's tyranny was short-lived because he did not do the same to Marcus Brutus and Brutus's co-conspirators among the Roman nobility. Given time constraints, I cannot fully substantiate my mildly provocative claims regarding Machiavelli's endorsement of a specifically Greek kind of tyrant. That is, one who murders nobles and who economically and militarily empowers the common people. I just want to offer a few remarks on the counterintuitive notion that this type of tyrant serves as Machiavelli's model of an ideal Republican reformer. I can only suggest here that the figures of Cleomenes and Clearchus in the discourses complete the lessons offered by Machiavelli's examples of Hiero, Agathocles, and Nabis from The Prince. These individuals, quote-unquote civil princes, as Machiavelli somewhat ambiguously calls them in the one book, in The Prince, tyrants, as he more frankly calls them in the other, the Discourses, do not invariably establish monarchical dynasties. More intriguingly, they actually lay the foundations for republics more healthy and vigorous, that is, more egalitarian and martial, than the oligarchic and weak republics that they initially usurped. In words that Machiavelli uses in a related context, such princes, quote, keep the public rich and the citizens poor, unquote, at home, and they strike fear in the hearts of enemies abroad. Machiavelli's most overt praise for a Greek tyrant in The Prince occurs in chapter 9, the well-known chapter devoted to the topic of, quote, civil principalities, unquote. There, Machiavelli extols the political achievements of Nabis the Spartan, but he demurs from specifying the precise means that Nabis used to successfully attain his ends. According to Machiavelli, Nabis satisfied the Spartan people to such an extent that he successfully managed to withstand military assaults by, quote, all of Greece, unquote, and even by the Roman Republic. Yet, somewhat curiously, Machiavelli declares that he cannot provide any details of how Nabis both gained the people to himself and fought off superiorly numbered foreign enemies. Machiavelli laments that there are too many ways to do so, and he declares rather unhelpfully, there are no fixed rules that apply to such circumstances. This in the world's most famous how-to book on politics. However, if we consult Livy and Polybius, Nabis behaves in very much the same way as two Syracusan princes whose actions Machiavelli recounts in chapters immediately preceding chapter 9, Hiero and Agathocles. In chapter 6, Machiavelli describes how Hiero rose from private to princely station through Syracuse's civic military. And later, he relates how Hiero ended his city's dependence on mercenary soldiers, quote-unquote, cutting to pieces the latter, and thus further winning over Syracuse's citizen soldiers to himself. In command of a now exclusively civil military, Hiero prevents the ever-voracious Roman Republic from conquering all of Sicily. In chapter 8, Machiavelli describes how Agathocles rose from even humbler beginnings than Hiero to become Prince of Syracuse, winning the city's citizen soldiers to himself through arduous military exploits and by murdering all of Syracuse's senators and wealthiest citizens. Agathocles then audaciously invades Africa to impose a truce on the mighty Carthaginian Republic that leaves the entire island of Sicily to himself. If we consider Nabis in light of both the historical sources and Machiavelli's accounts of Hiero and Agathocles, we observe that all three Greek princes liberate their peoples from both domestic and external oppression in similar ways. All three enhance the civic quality of their cities' militaries. Hiero eliminates unreliable foreign mercenaries, and both Agathocles and Nabis make fighting subjects out of former slaves to expand their military forces. All three resort to fraud in foreign affairs. Agathocles revokes an unfavorable alliance with Carthage. Hiero switches allegiances at his convenience between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And Nabis betrays the Macedonian monarchy to the diplomatic and military advantage of his patria. Indeed, all three princes, often treated as petty tyrants by ancient writers, impose advantageous truces upon, arguably, the greatest military powers in history: Macedonia, Carthage, and Rome. In domestic affairs, Agathocles murders his city's nobles, quote-unquote, at a stroke, in so doing becoming Machiavelli's first exemplar of, quote, cruelty well used, unquote. According to Livy and Polybius, Nabis takes a more protracted route toward the same end. He intermittently kills, tortures, and exiles the richest and most powerful Spartans in order to redistribute their wealth to the people. To sum up, Hiero, Agathocles, and Nabis all resort to cruelty and criminality to improve the conditions of their cities domestically and internationally. They either murder mercenaries or kill rich, prominent citizens. They all betray powerful foreign allies, and they all successfully enlist their enlarged civil militaries to defend their fatherlands from external domination. Indeed, Machiavelli's supposedly lesser examples, Hiero and Agathocles, prove more successful than Nabis, his explicit model of a civil prince, at laying the groundwork for the future reestablishment of republics in their cities. Diodorus and Justin report that Agathocles restores Syracuse's democracy from his deathbed. And in the Discourses, Machiavelli suggests that Hiero kept Syracuse so well ordered that its citizens and soldiers reinstituted, quote-unquote, a free way of life after killing his corrupt grandson, Hieronymus. Ultimately, the princely interregnums of Agathocles and Hiero initiate and guide the transformations of formerly oligarchic republics into more democratic ones. All three so-called tyrants left their republics by important standards in better civic and military conditions than when they first usurped them. In the Discourses, Machiavelli embeds his discussion of Greek tyrants within a broader account of the unavoidable corruption to which all republics must succumb. It is inevitable, Machiavelli insists throughout the book, that inequality will rise in republics over time. At first, Machiavelli describes pernicious inequality in purely civil terms. All republics, even Rome, he suggests, are destined to suffer a serious decline in equality before the law. But, much more subtly, Machiavelli also intimates that this rise in civil inequality can be traced to an underlying expansion of economic inequality. I'm thinking here of Discorsi 1:17-18, 1:55, and 3:24. More problematically, as Machiavelli ultimately reveals in Discorso 1:37 on the agrarian laws in Rome, economic inequality is a republican disease not easily amenable to a strictly republican cure. The Gracchi exhibited good intentions, Machiavelli suggests, when they sought to address the economic inequality that was corrupting Rome's civic military virtue after the Punic Wars. But, he concludes, they exhibited mortally woeful prudence when they expected the Roman Senate to sit quietly by while they passed legislation that would stem this economic inequality. The Gracchi effectively asked the Senate permission to legally distribute to the increasingly impoverished Roman plebs the vast wealth controlled by the Senate. The Roman Senate, as we know, responded by murdering one Gracchus brother and compelling the suicide of the other. In a different section of the Discourses, Machiavelli recounts how the Greek tyrant Cleomenes witnessed his predecessor, Agis, suffer a similar fate as the Gracchi. At the behest of the Spartan nobility, the chief magistrates, the ephors, murdered Agis before he could reinstitute Lycurgus's laws and so restore economic equality to the republic. Quote, using his authority well, unquote, according to Machiavelli, Cleomenes took the initiative in murdering the ephors rather than be eliminated by them. Unimpeded by aristocratic obstruction, he then set about reestablishing equality in Sparta. Machiavelli's example of Cleomenes better specifies in the discourses the role that redistribution must play in the tyrannical reformation of a republic in which corrupting inequality has taken hold, an idea that Machiavelli only intimates in The Prince. Similarly, the example of Clearchus in the discourses completes a lesson concerning class allegiances that Machiavelli left only partially taught in The Prince. In chapter 9 of that book, Machiavelli defines the quote-unquote civil principality as a regime where an individual is elevated to princely station by either one or the other competing social classes of every city, either by the nobles, who are driven by the humor to oppress the people, or by the people, who are motivated by the humor to avoid aristocratic oppression. Machiavelli provides reasons, both strategic and moral, why a prince should establish his principality on a popular rather than an aristocratic base. But he also opens the possibility that a civil prince who is elevated by the nobility to oppress the people might correct this disadvantaged position by simply switching sides once in power. In fact, Machiavelli suggests, the people will show even greater affection and devotion to a prince who defies their expectations of intensified oppression and delivers instead complete alleviation of aristocratic domination. Leo Strauss astutely notes that Machiavelli, uncharacteristically, provides no historical example in chapter 9 of a civil prince who comes to power through the nobility. Strauss intimates that Machiavelli doesn't need to do so, because the most proximate example of such a prince is the very addressee of the book, the House of Medici. The Medici, of course, were brought back from exile by an aristocratic coup that overthrew the democratic republic, the Governo Largo, presided over by Piero Soderini and faithfully served by Machiavelli himself. Machiavelli had made himself an enemy of the Florentine Ottomati by, among other things, encouraging Soderini to establish a large citizen military within the city and reduce the republic's reliance on mercenaries. As we know, the Florentine nobles watered down Machiavelli's plans for a civil militia, and they eventually enlisted a foreign power, the Spanish army, to reinstall the Medici in the city to help them disempower the Florentine people. Less discussed is the fact that Machiavelli's first act upon the Medici's return was to pen a memorandum to the new princes, I Paleschi, imploring them to switch sides and make the people, rather than the nobles, the foundation of their regime. The Medici responded by shutting down the People's Assembly, the Concilio Grande, and eventually by arresting and torturing Machiavelli. The Medici never instituted a civic military in Florence, and so the city remained at the mercy of foreign powers, namely the French and Spanish monarchies and the German emperor. I suggest that we should read Machiavelli's account of Clearchus in the Discourses in light of these circumstances. Machiavelli describes how the nobles of ancient Heraclea, fed up with the people contesting their authority, recalled Clearchus from exile to help them oppress the city's common citizens. However, upon his return, Clearchus behaves in a decidedly un-Medician fashion. Clearchus cuts to pieces the entire Heraclean nobility, quote, to the extreme delight of the people, unquote. We might wonder whether the metaphor of cutting the rich into pieces signifies nothing less than the partitioning, parceling, and redistribution of their wealth to the people. In any case, Clearchus got the memo that the Medici ignored centuries later. To repeat, the amalgam of these examples of Greek tyrants from both the Prince and the Discourses, I argue, illustrate what Machiavelli demands from a republican reformer. A tyrant cum civil prince must eliminate the nobility whose desire to oppress and excessive authority make healthy civic and economic equality impossible within republics, and he must deploy a large citizen army, large enough to keep at bay expansive military powers like the Macedonian, Carthaginian, and Roman empires. The Medici, by contrast, follow the less preferable examples of earlier pro-aristocratic tyrants like Appius Claudius, Sulla, Augustus, and Walter, the Duke of Athens. The Medici, deeply defective civil princes, effectively coddle the oppressive sons of Brutus at home and facilitate continued domination by the likes of France, Spain, and Germany. Foreign powers whom, incidentally, Machiavelli considers vastly inferior to ancient Macedonia, Carthage, and Rome. Now, an aristocratic republican of Ciceronian, Skinnerian, or Straussian stripe might raise the following objection to my account of Machiavelli's Greek tyrant. Having removed the principal check on his own power, i.e. the nobility or senate of his republic, won't this so-called civil prince simply become an unaccountably oppressive tyrant? The answer implied by Machiavelli is not necessarily. Machiavelli's civil prince is always both enabled and constrained by his subject citizens. Citizen subjects who are fully and extensively armed and who enjoy relatively equal socioeconomic status with each other may rather easily convert a civil principality into a republic, especially should their tyrant ever fail to observe, quote-unquote, cruelty well used, and instead begin to engage in cruelty as such. This, I believe, is one of the most important implications of Machiavelli's assertion, quote, where there are good arms, there are always good laws, unquote. In point of fact, the princely individual who empowers his people both civically and militarily is a tyrant in name only. Machiavelli's ideal civil prince is sufficiently prudent to abide by a statement attributed to the so-called tyrant Agathocles, quote, I require no bodyguards because the people are my bodyguards, unquote. Thank you.
Eric?
Great. Well, let me begin first also by thanking Professor Mansfield and the Program on Constitutional Government for organizing this and inviting me to think again about a set of issues I haven't thought about in quite a while, and it's a pleasure to be in this particular company as I do so. Since the basic humanist commitment is that questions should be debated in utramque partem, I will take it upon myself in the presence of all of this thrilling revisionism to be very old-fashioned and say something rather different about the question. I think both that there is something to the category of civic humanism and that we can profitably think about Machiavelli in relation to it. The second claim is slippery. I'm trying to wriggle out of this, the binary that's sort of teed up by the title of the panel. Is Machiavelli or is he not a civic humanist? My answer is sort of. And it matters really not at all to me whether one says that Machiavelli was an exceedingly heterodox civic humanist or an exceedingly sympathetic critic of civic humanism. One way or the other, I think there are very important commonalities that might help us to understand his thought and very important differences that I want to say something about. I really am just going to make several basic points. The first is about civic humanism itself. I begin by recognizing and wholeheartedly endorsing the view that Professor Hankins was setting out, namely that the representative character of civic humanism, if indeed there was such a thing, has been greatly exaggerated, and that we've suffered for a very long time from a kind of Florentino-centrism anyway when thinking about Italian political thought in the Renaissance. The vast majority of humanists were princely humanists. They would not belong in this category. This, I think, is both very important and something I'm happy to grant. However, I think there is something to using the term civic humanism, at least loosely, to refer to the civic ideology defended by the coterie of humanist writers who found themselves living in the holdout republics after the signorial revolution of the late Duecento and Trecento. Figures like Leonardo Bruni, Poggio, Salutati, Ruccini, and others. And what I want to say about this concept, which I regard as a heuristic device. I mean, it's useful only to the extent that it helps us capture a kind of orientation or set of shared commitments among a group of important figures. I think first and foremost, if it's anything, it's fundamentally a historiographical position. That is, it's a position about the character of Roman history and how to tell it. The view that it is challenging and sort of systematically opposing is the overwhelmingly dominant view in all of the previous period of Western Christian history that Rome reached its zenith after 31 BC, after Actium, that the rise of the Principate, what we call the empire, although they certainly didn't, that is, they didn't distinguish republic from empire in the way that we now do. That distinction is a product of the period that we're discussing. But the idea is that Rome reaches its maximal greatness under Augustus and his successors, that this fact is acknowledged by God himself, who sends Jesus into the world under the reign of Augustus, and that the expansion of Rome under its emperors is part of providential design to allow the spread of the gospel. Basically, this view. It's not that this view goes completely unchallenged. You could think of someone like Ptolemy of Luca, who has very interesting things to say on the other side. But certainly, it is the standard view. You can think of Dante in the Commedia. The very lowest level of the Inferno is the site of the great traitors, and dangling from Lucifer's jowls are, on the one hand, Judas Iscariot, and on the other, Brutus and Cassius, right, who are not tyrannicides on this picture. They're traitors, rebels, who upended the legitimate rule of Caesar. So first and foremost, I think, civic humanism is dedicated to the rejection of that picture. Rome on this view, and here they agree with the sort of nostalgics for the form of government under consul, senate, and tribunes, which becomes known, although it wasn't, as Professor Hankins has pointed out, called republican government in distinction with what comes next by the Roman sources. So the argument is that Rome reaches its greatness under what we call the Republic, that the Republic is dismembered by faction and ultimately gives way to a much inferior form of government under the Principate, in which there is less virtue because there is less freedom. And you can think of the sort of great statement of this in Bruni's Laudatio, where the greatness of Florence is to be understood in relation to the fact that it was founded by Rome when Rome was maximally great and maximally free, that is, before the princes. So first and foremost, I think that's the basic commitment of civic humanism. And of course, what it implies is a rejection of the entire system of thought that characterized the civic ideology of seigneurial government in the Italian context, which revived and then repackaged in important ways the Senecan theory of the ideal prince from the De Clementia, and also, of course, adapted Cicero in strange and interesting ways to do the same kind of work. On this view, we become free when we're ruled by a virtuous prince, because liberty is just the rule of reason. The prince will free us by ruling us. Providence has ordained this scheme, and in this great providential order, everything that is virtuous and good, honestum, is also useful. So the civic humanist ideology I take to be a rejection of that standard view. So that would be point number one. Point number two is about the centrality in this way of thinking of the idea of glory. Glory, greatness, grandezza, and empire. And this is not purely a civic humanist commitment. That is, it's a commitment that princely humanists in the earlier period are equally enthusiastic about. So this would be, let's say, a shared commitment. One can think, for example, of Petrarch writing in his letter to Francesca de Carrara in 1373, in which he says about the prince that he should lust after the treasure of virtue and win the fame of outstanding glory. This is a property that moths and rust cannot corrupt, nor can thieves steal it in the night. Many of you will recognize the phrase there. That quotation is taken from Matthew's Gospel. But of course, in Matthew's Gospel, the phrase is, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where rust and moth destroy and thieves break in and steal, but store up treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust will destroy, nor thieves break in and steal." So for Petrarch, the message of the gospel is inverted in this respect. What is imperishable and outstandingly worthy is worldly glory, not treasure in heaven, and that reevaluation seems to me, which is obviously so redolent of Machiavelli himself, seems to me to be powerfully present in the humanist tradition from the beginning. Petrarch, of course, is given the last word in The Prince, the very, very last word. In the final chapter, the sort of powerfully rhetorical summons to the liberation of Italy. We're left with Petrarch's praise for the idea of recovering l'antico valore nell'italici cor, the ancient valor of Italian hearts. Petrarch, of course, though, was a princely humanist, but it didn't take very much for the ideologists of the city republics, if we want to call them that, noting the difficulty about the sort of semantic quarrel over the term respublica that Professor Hankins was discussing. Very easy for them simply to tweak the Petrarchan account by saying, look, in practice, in fact, we only acquire true glory and greatness, or at least the most of it that we can, when we live in free states, these free states that are to be regarded as republics. Why? Well, because, and here they'll all quote Sallust in particular, princes cannot support virtue, because virtuous subjects are a danger to princes. They have to be suspicious of the virtuous. Also, those who are unfree and slavish and sort of exist in the power of someone else become slavish and therefore less virtuous. It's in the free state that we will have virtuous citizens who will go out and get as much glory as possible. So you can think of it seems to me a kind of canonical statement of this position appears in Bruni's History of Florence in the sixth book. It's put in the mouth of Pino della Tossa, talking about the recommending the acquisition of Lucca, a position that we know Bruni endorsed, and Pino is made to say, "Think of how much the glory, the fame, and majesty of the Florentine people will grow if a city which has been nearly our equal in wealth and power should be made subject to you. For my part, I confess, as one who practices the common life and moral customs of mankind, I am moved by the things that men hold to be goods, extending borders, enlarging empire, raising on high the glory and splendor of the state, assuring our own security and advantage. If we say that these are not desirable things, then the welfare of the republic, patriotism, and practically this whole life of ours will be overthrown. So I take that to be a pretty straightforward statement of this basic civic humanist commitment to glory and the sort of honor-loving apparatus of Roman civic ideology. And this view had its extremely committed opponents. And here I think, at the very least, Machiavelli and civic humanists share a common enemy. So here is Erasmus writing 2 years before Machiavelli wrote The Prince, or at least the text is printed in 1511 in The Praise of Folly. He's describing the great Roman civic heroes and arguing that actually these figures are all the children of folly. As he writes, besides, what was it that prevailed upon the Decii so that they offered themselves of their own free will to the gods of the underworld? What dragged Curtius into the chasm, if not vainglory, the sweetest siren, but one denounced passionately by philosophers? What could be more foolish, they ask, than for a man seeking office to flatter the mob, to purchase support with gifts, to pursue the applause of all the fools, to be pleased with their acclamations, to be carried about in triumph as if he were some image to be gazed at by the people, and to stand in the forum cast in bronze? Add divine honors bestowed on little men and even the most wicked tyrants being transformed into gods in public ceremonies. This is the folly which spawns states. Dominions are established by it, as are magistracies, civil religions, councils, and law courts, nor is human life anything other than some game of folly. So I take that to be the other view, and it's certainly not Machiavelli's. So that would be point number 2. Point number 3, and this will be my last one, although it seems to me there are others, is the point that that Professor Hankins flagged at the beginning, and that is that Machiavelli accepts the semantic shift initiated by the civic ideologists of these city republics in the 15th century, namely the capture of the term res publica to refer exclusively to non-princely states, the contrast, the distinction between republics and principalities, and the statement, which is, again, not unqualified. There are some difficult passages here, as there are in most cases with Machiavelli, but in general, the vivere libero, the free way of life, is to be had in republics. Republics alone are free states. And in princely government, one does not have the vivere libero, although one might have the vivere politico. That's a different and complicated question. But certainly a princely state is not a free state. It is not a res publica because it is a res privata. It is a private thing. It is the possession of a single person, un stato di uno, as Machiavelli says. And it is in republics, in contrast, where we have freedom, and here, of course, he's rejecting, along with the civic humanists, the identity of liberty and the rational government of a prince that the sort of Senecan and princely tradition had championed, to argue that, in fact, in republics alone, we have the vivere libero, and there is the reason why republics will be greater and achieve more grandezza than their rivals. All of those positions, it seems to me, are in common with civic humanism. Well, where's the but? There are a lot of them. Among the civic humanist commitments that Machiavelli rejects, we might list the equation of the honestum and the utile. That is the insistence that whatever is right and just is also useful and practical. Now, that's not just a civic humanist commitment, as Professor Hankins explained. That is just a humanist commitment, equally important in princely humanism. But certainly, it's a position that Machiavelli rejects. Machiavelli rejects the standard preference for a governo stretto, a kind of a narrow regime in favor of a governo largo. Machiavelli rejects the value of concord, the idea of concordia ordinum, the kind of peaceful, non-tumultuous coexistence of the different orders of the state in favor of a praise of tumulti. As Professor McCormick mentioned, he certainly offers, if not a direct rejection, then certainly a highly ambivalent verdict on the standard civic humanist praise for riches as essential ingredients in the greatness and glory of states. He rejects the standard civic humanist view that it was both the motives and the practice of the Gracchi that were odious in the case of the agrarian laws. And there is almost a sort of a microcosm of the general point, because in the chapter that Professor McCormick mentioned, chapter 37 of the first discourse, you think you're going to get a standard Ciceronian story. It begins like what scandals the agrarian laws gave birth to in Rome, like Cicero, who calls the agrarian laws a pestis, a plague. Machiavelli calls them a morbo. And so you think, all right, well, I know what's coming, but then not so much. Certainly the idea that it's important to mantenere I cittadini poveri is a point of contrast with the standard civic humanist tradition, as of course is his account of what virtue is. That is, what does it consist in? All right, it's necessary to get us glory, but what exactly are the things and behaviors that will get us glory? So at this point, you might say, it's beginning to sound like the old joke where one guy says to another, what is green, hangs on the wall and whistles? And the other guy says, what? And he says, well, it's a herring. He says, really, a herring? But a herring isn't green. And he says, well, you paint it green. And he says, well, all right, but a herring doesn't hang on the wall. He says, well, just put a nail through it. It'll hang on the wall. He says, well, but a herring doesn't whistle. He says, all right, it doesn't whistle. Is this the same kind of story? Well, yeah, this is indeed a gigantic but. I think Machiavelli, as I said, if he's a civic humanist, he's an exceedingly heterodox one. If he's not a civic humanist, there's much in civic humanism to which he is attracted. And I think civic humanism is not unusual in that respect when we look at Machiavelli. I think that we could say the same thing about his relationship with many other traditions. One, of course, would be Epicureanism, a subject that Professor Rahe has written about with great skill. Is Machiavelli an Epicurean? Well, he's either an exceedingly heterodox Epicurean, or he's an extremely sympathetic critic of Epicureanism. Lovely man, shame about the ethics. So, I think this is not an unusual pattern to find in Machiavelli, and I think accounts for rather than diminishes his extraordinary originality.
Thank you. Paul?
I would also like to thank Harvey, and I'd like to thank Anna for that fine dinner last night and for their hospitality. On the question of Machiavelli and civic humanism, I long ago had my say. I believe that his thinking concerning republicanism, and for that matter monarchy, marks a sharp break not only with the thinking articulated by Aristotle and Cicero, but also with the outlook that underpinned political praxis in both Greece and Rome. If I'm right, his political science is predicated on a denial that man is, in the Aristotelian and Ciceronian sense, a political animal, and a reestablishment of political science on an apolitical and even anti-political foundation akin to the position of Lucretius. Today, however, I want to glance at this question from a completely different angle. Our focus is not the discourses on Livy, it is the Prince. And there is in the latter work a chapter that has not received the close attention that I think it deserves. I have in mind the 11th chapter of the book that Machiavelli entitled, not the Prince, but De Principatibus, on principalities, and he's using a word that is invented to describe the new regime established by Augustus Caesar. It shows up, for example, in Tacitus as an alternative to res publica, with Tacitus saying, there's no one alive when Augustus dies who remembers or who has seen the res publica. So from a Tacitian point of view, what the medievals embrace as the greatness of Rome is a period when there is no res publica. There is only a tyranny. And there I agree with you, Jim. So what I want to talk about is the chapter called Of Ecclesiastical Principalities. It is, in a sense, a hidden chapter in the Prince. It is not included in the program laid out in the first chapter of the Prince. It appears as if out of nowhere, and it seems to go nowhere. It seems, in fact, to be a passing afterthought, and it is in the scholarly literature usually ignored. In his little book on Machiavelli, for example, Quentin Skinner makes no mention of ecclesiastical polities at all. And more to the point, in Politics and Vision, Sheldon Wallen reads Machiavelli as contending that, quote, ecclesiastical governments were irrelevant to the proper concerns of political science, and as thinking that they were, quote, not politic enough to warrant the attention of political thought, which is an odd statement given that he gives a chapter in The Prince to the subject. I think the precise opposite of Sheldon Wallen, that making sense of the ecclesiastical principality is central to Machiavelli's new political science, and that the chapter slipped in as a surprise is crucial to his larger purpose. Consider what the Florentine says in the pertinent chapter about ecclesiastical principalities. All difficulties regarding them come before they are possessed, because they are acquired either by virtue or by fortune, and are maintained without the one or the other. For they are sustained by orders that have grown old with religion, which have been so powerful and of such a kind that they keep their princes in the state however they proceed and live. And here's the kicker. These alone have states and do not defend them. They have subjects and do not govern them. And the states, though ungoverned, do not care, and they neither think of becoming estranged from such princes, nor can they. Thus, only these principalities are secure and prosperous. So Sheldon Wallen proposes that we ignore the only principalities that are secure and prosperous. It's crazy. It is true that Machiavelli goes on to say that these principalities subsist by superior causes to which the human mind does not reach, and that he will omit speaking of them, for since they are exalted and maintained by God, it would be the opposite of a presumptuous and foolhardy man to discourse on them. But there is in this disclaimer more than a trace of sarcasm, and after saying non di manco, he goes on to discuss what only the presumptuous and the foolhardy would discuss, which I regard as, from his point of view, as the central mystery of modern politics, the reason why ancient political science is out of date. It is, he indicates, priestcraft that modern princes operating in principalities and republic likes must get their minds around. There's another chapter in which obliquely Machiavelli touches on the same question. I have in mind the central chapter of the first part of The Prince, chapter 6, where he addresses a subject quite near and dear to his heart, new principalities that are acquired through one's own arms and virtue. It is in this chapter that he makes use of language that he will again deploy in the preface to the first book of the Discourses on Livy to describe himself. It is in this chapter of The Prince that he speaks of new princes as founders who have introduced new orders and modes. It is also in this chapter that he playfully and mischievously equates Moses on the one hand and Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus on the other hand as exemplars, as the new princes and founders who most deserve imitation. It is, moreover, in this chapter that he speaks of these men in religious language as armed prophets, and that he echoes the book of Revelations on the problem posed by lukewarmness and treats its chief source, the incredulity of men who do not truly believe in new things, as the central political problem faced by new princes who introduce new orders and modes. So the emphasis lies on belief, on creed, on incredulity, on lukewarmness, and how do you deal with the lukewarm? In treating religion under the rubric of political science, and in speaking of political founders as prophets, Machiavelli ostentatiously follows the lead of the Arab Falasifa, Al-Farabi and his followers, and Avicenna and Averroes. He is silent, to be sure, about Muhammad, and he makes no mention of Jesus Christ. But he could be confident that his contemporaries would think about what he left unsaid. From a Renaissance Italian perspective, Muhammad was the armed prophet par excellence, and one cannot speak of Savonarola as an unarmed prophet, as Machiavelli does, without causing those who live within what was called the res publica Christiana to reflect on the manner in which one unmentioned, and perhaps in this context unmentionable prophet, who appears to have been unarmed, managed to establish the only modern principality in Europe that is secure and prosperous. In the opening chapter of the third book of his Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli will bring the res publica Christiana openly into the picture, and there he will suggest that sects are very much like republics and kingdoms, in that to achieve renewal they need to be led back towards their beginnings, and he describes the manner in which St. Francis and St. Dominic achieved this. For with poverty and with the example of the life of Christ, the only time Christ is mentioned by name in the Discourses on Livy, they brought back into the minds of men what had already been eliminated there. Their new orders were so powerful that they are the cause that the dishonesty of the prelates and of the heads of the religion do not ruin it. Living still in poverty and having so much credit with peoples in confessions and sermons, they give them to understand that it is evil to say evil of evil, and that it is good to live under obedience to them, and if they make an error, to leave them for God to punish. So they do the worst they can because they do not fear the punishment that they do not see and do not believe. This renewal, therefore, has maintained and does maintain this religion. There is more to this passage than a savage anti-clericalism, for it savors as well of a grudging admiration, and it explains how an unarmed prophet could succeed. There are other threads to be pursued in The Prince. As I already mentioned, the title that Machiavelli gave to this work is De Principatibus. This title is in Latin, and it has as its focus a word that was coined at Rome to describe that polity's rule by an individual who presented himself to the public not as a king or rex, but as the princeps, or first man, of a res publica, by him restored and renewed. In The Prince and in his Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli asserts that there are two diverse humors that one must take account of, the great ones and the people. In the 19th chapter of The Prince, however, he introduces a third humor, the soldiers. Most of those, he tells us, who came to the Principate as new men, once they recognized the difficulty of these two diverse humors, and he means the people and the soldiers in this case, turned to satisfying the soldiers, caring little about injuring the people. The greatest and most successful of these would appear to be Septimius Severus, who possessed so much virtue that by keeping the soldiers his friends, although the people were overburdened by him, he was always able to rule prosperously, because his virtues made him so admirable in the sight of the soldiers and the people that the latter remained somehow astonished and stupefied, while the former were reverent and satisfied. The language that Machiavelli uses in this passage is reminiscent of what he has said earlier in The Prince about the impact on the people of the Romagna of Cesare Borgia's sacrifice of Ramiro de Orco, which left them satisfied and stupefied. And it points forward to the discussion in his Discourses on Livy of those Roman imperatores who sparked a renewal at Rome by an active devotio, which is to say by ostentatiously sacrificing their own lives. All of this may be pertinent to our understanding of the Christian ecclesiastical polity, which has as its central ritual a reenactment of a human sacrifice intended to leave its adherents not only astonished and stupefied, but reverent and satisfied as well. Be this as it may be, Machiavelli goes on to say that in his time in Europe, where hereditary monarchy is the norm, the soldiers pose less of a problem, and that rulers should focus on satisfying the people. He goes further, however, in observing that the Ottoman Turk and Egypt's Sultan are exceptions to what is the norm in Europe and are dependent on the soldiers. And then in telling fashion, he compares the Janissary Mamluk regimes, predominant under Sunni Islam, to the Christian pontificate, which cannot be called either a hereditary principality or a new principality. For it is not the sons of the old prince who are their heirs and become lords, but the one who is elected to that rank by those who have authority for it. And this being an ancient order, one cannot call it a new principality because some of the difficulties in new principalities are not in it. For if the prince is indeed new, the orders of that state are old and are ordered to receive him as if he were their hereditary lord. The clergy would appear to be, to the Christian pontificate, what the Janissaries and Mamluks are to the principates established on something like the Roman model in Constantinople and Cairo. But there is, of course, this difference. Regarding politics dominated by a third humor akin to the Christian clergy, one could say, these alone have states and do not defend them. They have subjects and do not govern them, and the states, though ungoverned, do not care, and they neither think of becoming estranged nor can they. Thus, only these principalities are secure and prosperous. The Pope's soldiers form an occupying army throughout Europe, and they have mastered the art of controlling men's minds. What then would a would-be modern new prince learn from Machiavelli's ruminations on ecclesiastical principalities? This matter, like many other matters, Old Nick leaves to be pondered by those who will come after. I can only say that in considering this question, I frequently find myself thinking of a remark John Pocock once made to me, that the first genuinely Machiavellian prince in the world was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon is said to have coined the word ideology, at least John Adams says this, which is a term that came to be used to describe the manner in which popularized philosophy, Lockeanism, for example, could be made to substitute for religion as the foundation for civil society. As the Napoleonic Code indicates, Napoleon himself was the very model of a modern enlightened monarch. As such, he put himself at the head of what Voltaire once called the party of humanity. There would be others who would follow in Napoleon's wake. Like him, they would govern in the name of an idea. And just as the Christian church of Machiavelli's day had a society for the propagation of the faith that made use of what in Latin they called propaganda, so would Napoleon and his successors make use of this tool. And the latter, his successors, would do so with the help of a hierarchically organized, ideological political party that functioned in the manner of the Christian clergy, as an army of occupation intent, above all else, on occupying men's minds. There would be this one difference, to be sure. The Napoleonic principality and the new principalities constructed in the 20th century had states, and they defended them. They possessed subjects, and they governed them. They combined the functions of Caesar and of Christ in one head. They deployed force and propaganda to powerful effect at the same time. Whether Machiavelli would have been fully pleased with the result, however, I cannot say. Thank you.
Thanks. I have to do something here. As I mentioned earlier, I've been asked to end in 10:45 to allow a 15-minute break before the next panel. So I would ask people who wish to make comments or raise questions to speak concisely and tersely. Since I'm not wearing my distance glasses, I cannot guarantee that I will recognize you. So could you please identify yourself?
I'm Michael Lewis, and I just wanted to contradict something that Paul Weber just said about Napoleon. The word ideology used by Napoleon, he didn't invent it. The ideologue, thank you so much. The ideologue invented the term. It was a conscious term used by Destutt de Tracy to talk about a kind of Lockean way of thinking about things. What Napoleon did was turn it into a term of contempt. And for Napoleon, in fact, the reason why ideologues were contemptible was that they didn't have the kind of Aristotelian judgment which a proper statesman should have, but just had abstract schemes. So I think if you're going to use the word ideologie to characterize Napoleonic politics, you might have to do it with a slightly different story. Thank you.
Bill Connell?
It was a great analysis of the 15th century embracing of the distinction between republic and principality by the humanists. There's an older tradition that says, it's dependent largely on chapter 1 of The Prince, that says that Machiavelli's distinction of two kinds of states is actually a step towards the understanding of a modern state. And do you see any new conception of a state in the 15th century humanists' adoption of the distinction? And then is the neoclassical humanism that you describe, these virtue theorists, would you link them with the modern state in any way?
Well, when Machiavelli distinguishes between republics and principalities, he's following a linguistic usage that had been in play for about half a century. And it's, I think, started by Bruni with his translation of the Politics, rather unwillingly, in fact, because but it's picked up by other people, and you start seeing discussions, in fact, pushback from princely humanists who don't like the fact that they can't use the word republic anymore to refer to their principalities. Or Michele Savonarola, for example, complains bitterly that these people like Bruni have co-opted the term, have appropriated the term, and they want, because they are used to using the word res publica to describe the Duke of Milan or the Marquess of d'Este. So they don't want to lose the positive connotations of that. So Machiavelli, I think, is following what I call the Italian usage of res publica, but the older usage of res publica as a good state, any good state, any morally acceptable state that's not tyrannical, I think it is still the dominant one even in Italy. Now, whether it indicates a new understanding of state as such, I think that's a very long question. I haven't reflected on that very much, and I'm actually not very keen on the idea that there is a state even in the early 16th century. I prefer to stick to the usage of the term as it was used by contemporaries, where Stato doesn't mean anything like modern state. And what was the third part about the neoclassical? You were asking something?
Yeah, so if you...
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, where I think the humanists actually do, they tend to be dismissed as having any relevance to modern state building at all, as you know. But I think where they are relevant is this insistence on meritocracy and their hostility to pure hereditary power. This is really their major theme. Just to mention your paper a bit, Eric, what I tried to do in this book is to read a lot more sources than the half dozen sources that commonly get cited because they're translated into English. So, and there are hundreds of sources from humanist political theory, not just formal treatises, but also orations and plays and so forth. And themes like glory are certainly popular among some humanists, but not among others. There's humanists who don't believe in the expansion of the state, especially Venetian humanists, who are hostile to it. The humanists who follow the Spartan model, there are different schools, and even there are different ideas about Roman history. Most of the humanists think that the old kings were part of the Republic, for example. They don't distinguish between sub regibus and sub consolibus. But where I think these humanists really are forward-looking is in this idea of a meritocratic elite, and they're looking forward to the noblesse de la robe, basically, and to the idea that that it's not that military power and inherited wealth, inherited land are not the basis of power, but some kind of skill or mastery, knowledge, education, something like that.
Yes?
I'm not sure if I should wait for the long passover.
Oh,
I can project. I do teach.
this is for recording.
Okay.
Okay. Hi. These were wonderful papers. I'm so happy to have been here to hear them. Really impressive and a lot to think about. In keeping with the directive, I'll try to keep my question really brief. It's a question for John. I was just wondering how, what you make of Machiavelli's criticism or apparent criticism of the immoderation shown by the Florentine people in subduing the great under the Republican regime of the 13th and 14th century. So in an effort to domesticate their own elites, they did what a lot of the things that you identify as being healthy reforms undertaken by princes, but they did it themselves, which would seem to be the preferable alternative, right? So they organized civil militias, they confiscated wealth, they killed lots of magnati, and yet Machiavelli opens Book 3 of the Histories by contrasting this very aggressive approach with Rome's sort of more moderate way of dealing with nobles, and says, look, you know, in Rome they disputed, but in Florence they fought. And in Rome, Rome rose to a great state of inequality, whereas Florence rose to a state of wonderful equality. And I'm not sure the word wonderful is meant to mean terrific. And ultimately, he says that it's the fact that Florence obliterated its nobility. It's that fact that has caused Florence to fall into this state of abject, vulnerability and weakness that it subsists in even in his own day. So that seems to be a pretty trenchant rebuttal of a version of what you're proposing as being his own recommendation. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
It's a great question, and it's often raised. People often remark on or quote the beginning of Book 3 without invoking the actions at the end of Book 2. So Machiavelli opens Book 3 by saying, oh, you know, the Florentine people were different than the Roman people because they didn't want to share offices with the nobles, whereas the Roman people were willing to share offices with the Roman nobles. But then if you go back to the very conclusion of Book 2, after the Duke of Athens is expelled, the guildsmen of Florence say, okay, let's reconcile with the Magnati, let's reorganize the signoria so that the nobles can hold office with us. We'll jointly share office in the signoria. And what do the nobles do as soon as they're there? They resort to arms to kick the people out of the common people, the lower guildsmen, out of those offices. So again, there is a consistency in the motivations, in the umori of the people and the grandi in both Florence and Rome, as dictated by Machiavelli's description of deeds rather than by his use of just words in that book.
Matt Landauer?
I also have a question for John McCormick. So I like the paper a lot, and I guess my question is about whether there's something antithetical between popular power in your view of Machiavelli's view, and organized form, like elaborated constitutional form, because it seems like the two mechanisms for popular power, if you're right, are one is tumults, which are not organized constitutional forms, and then the other would be these tyrants who take power and act maybe in the interest of the people and rely on popular legitimation, but they don't have elaborated constitutions. It's assemblies where they're acclaimed and then they go out and act. So is this a kind of deep problem for Machiavelli, this tension, or does it get resolved down the road?
It's a great question. I think, in a sense, the good tyrant from Machiavelli establishes the conditions for his own extinction. If not his own, then his successors. So the good tyrant, it seemed, if you go out of the Greek models I was talking about, but Romulus, the good tyrant does two things: arms the plebs and establishes a senate. And from that situation, you eventually lay the groundwork for a republic, because the people are able to use their arms to negotiate from the Senate, to overthrow the tyrant eventually, and then extract from the Senate concessions that allow for domestic freedom. And so I think the key is this form question you talk about, political power and political form. That's why it's all military for Machiavelli. And it's not an accident that the institution that Machiavelli calls the one that made Rome more perfect, the tribunes of the plebs, is itself, it starts with a military word, the tribunes, and it was made by the people seceding as an army from the city. And so there is in Machiavelli this translation of popular military power into popular political power.
Hi, I'm Rory Schachter. I wanted to ask about the use of the word umano, or humanity, in chapter 15 of The Prince. So first of all, it's interesting because these are these pairs of putative virtues and vices, and the pair is humano and superbo, so humanity and pride. And I mean, that struck me and struck other people as somewhat strange, perhaps innovative, because you'd think the opposite of pride would be humility. So I wanted to ask, first of all, whoever wishes to field the question, how common in Machiavelli's period or in the civic humanists' literature, or both, is this use of umano, humanity, as a contrast to pride or as a standalone virtue? Is this an innovation of Machiavelli? And then secondly, just what your thoughts might be, because it does seem to me you could say it's a replacement of humility by humanity as the stand-in virtue. And I just wondered what significance you might imagine we could place on that. I think one thing I would think of is that it's a sort of worldly self-assertion. That is to say, to speak of humanity instead of humility is to speak of worldly self-assertion, and so this would go along with some kind of anti-clericalism. The other suggestion I wonder what you think of would be to say that if it's true that Machiavelli counsels using the so-called virtues to mask your use of the necessary vices, does the knowing prince want to appear humane, or all humanity, to mask his or her pride? And so then one would have, in this sense, a certain defense of pride, but it would be a different defense, perhaps, than you'd find in classical philosophy, but still an anti-Christian defense.
Well, humanus just means kind in Latin, right? So and humanitas is the translation of philanthropia in Greek. So it means a sense of commonality, of shared humanity, or a love of humanity, a sympathy for humanity, which is the opposite of superbia, which is thinking yourself better than other people and trying to distinguish yourself from other people. I think that's responsible for the pairing. As to the question whether this virtue can be used instrumentally by the prince, sure. He uses all the virtues instrumentally, as far as I can see. Maybe Professor Mansfield wants to comment on that. I defer to higher authority on Machiavelli.
No, I have a different question.
All right.
I'd like to. I'd like to ask especially Eric and John and Jim. This is somewhat pushing Paul Rahe's point. I think you all underestimate the importance of the religious question. That these somewhat artificial historiographical terms, Renaissance and civic humanism, both do this. And let me do this by making absolute assertions, which you are free to contradict if you can. First, there is no humanist who attacks Christianity like Machiavelli. and I think that. And second,
There are humanists who have implied attacks on Christianity, but the problem is you're likely to be burned at a stake if you attack Christianity.
right, all right. And Machiavelli took that risk. Therefore, he was much bolder than
Yes,
humanist, and he was bolder in a shocking way. He did that deliberately. And a third, the importance that Paul Rahe attached to the new prince. That in the letter in which Machiavelli announces he's composed the prince, or De Principatibus, and he lists some of the things that he discusses in that book, but he says that it should be especially appealing to a new prince. Is there any, all right, now I make it a question, is there any humanist who speaks of, especially, and gives the same attention and emphasis that Machiavelli does to the new prince? And last, Savonarola. Is he a civic humanist? He is certainly very civic. And he's pretty democratic, too. And so Machiavelli took, I think, more interest than you do in Savonarola. That's not just
Right.
you, the three of you.
All right. Well,
Spoken yet. What about you?
I think the fact that they're speaking in classical Latin already excludes religion. I think that's what they, I think the humanists are aware that their project, at some level, that their project is not in harmony with Christendom, the project of Christendom. And it especially comes out if you start comparing them with Augustine's City of God, that they're aware that to improve humanity is a project that goes against the whole Christian idea of the fall of man and weakness of reason, weakness of the need for grace. And this is really a Renaissance thing to me, that the humanists do believe that it's impossible to get better societies and better human beings by study of the classical past. And that is implicitly a criticism of the church and of the Christendom as a project. Now, I'm not, how much they're aware of that or how much they're willing to get out in front on that is another issue. Machiavelli is a very courageous man. Some people would call him courageous in the yes, prime minister sense. When the I don't know how many of you are familiar with the British comedy, Yes, Prime Minister, but at a certain point, whenever the minister is about to do something particularly foolish, his head of department will say that, well, that would be very courageous, Prime Minister. And he says, oh, I don't want to do that. And there's an argument I heard eloquently made by Stephen Milner this summer that Machiavelli is not very politic, that he is telling the Medici something they really don't want to hear, and he still wants to get a job from them. He wants to tell them to behave like tyrants. Well, they're not going to. They don't want to hear that, and yet he's waiting for the phone call to come, and you're hired. And I don't think that was very smart. Machiavelli. It was very politic of him.
Got away with it.
Did he?
Well,
I don't think he got the job.
barely.
Although later on, interestingly, I was just thinking about this when John was talking, he does tell the Medici that their tyranny is going to be short-lived in the discourses, that they should prepare for the return to republicanism because they're inherently weak. So that I think supports your point about the idea of tyranny, Machiavelli.
Though he was wrong about the prediction.
And he was very wrong about that. He was wrong about religion too, because he didn't. He was writing at the time of Martin Luther, and he within the next 20 years, ecclesiastical polity after ecclesiastical polity would be overturned, not by arms but by another faith.
Maybe I'll just add something to that. I was trying to follow instructions and leave religion to the next panel. It's
Panel after next.
Yeah, panel after next. I think, well, picking up on something that Jim was saying, I think that one of the points I was trying to make is that there's a sense in which the Machiavellian position is at least on a continuum with, let's say, the position staked out by Petrarch, in which certainly a kind of conventional Augustinian kind of Christian system is turned upside down, and we get this praise of glory-seeking, glory-loving, the worldly achievement in this world, characteristic of the entire movement of Ciceronianism, which had its fierce opponents by a sort of overlapping consensus, if you want, of kind of Platonists, various kinds of Epicureans, Augustinian Christians, all of whom were attacking the so-called middle pleasures or the empty pleasures of fame and glory and wealth and honor-loving and all of this as being pagan. The complaint that you get in Erasmus is that all of these people are turning Christ into Romulus. I mean, it's just it's a kind of a standard critique. I think it might beg the question a little bit to say that therefore it isn't Christian. I think all of these people have an understanding, or many of them. Again, there are complicated debates to be had about the sincerity of the views, but at least a number of them have the view that one can redeem Christianity from Augustine and recapture a kind of Pelagian Christianity that doesn't involve the idea of fallenness, that doesn't stigmatize pride and the idea of virtue and standing and desert and merit, this seems to me very consistent with Machiavelli's insistence on freedom, the ability to seize the occasione, that it's not all determined, and so on, and the idea that one can the claim in chapter 2 of the second discourse, the famous discussion of religion, where he says, it isn't Christianity, but it's what these degenerates have made of Christianity. One can have a Christianity that loves the fatherland. I, like you, am dubious that Machiavelli means this with any with anything approaching sincerity, but certainly it's very, very similar to what, say, Ptolemy of Lucca says, turning patriotism into a Christian virtue, and arguing that you could imagine a Christianity in which the first obligation of the divine law is to seek the greatness of the patria. So I don't think Machiavelli is off on his own little island quite to that, to the degree that you suggest, although I think he certainly has staked out a private corner of that island.
Very, very briefly, I don't want to leave my host.
We will
it's up
get
to our
the panel on religion.
It's
where
up
you
to our
all
host
can
whether
get a
he wants
chance.
an answer from me or not, or he wants to end the panel.
Can the next
if-
panel maybe start a little later if we're to have the break? I'm just following your orders, sir.
If I were, thank you for that question, Harvey. If I were to speak at length, in particular about Agathocles, it would be unavoidable. The question of religion and Christianity would be unavoidable. Machiavelli places Agathocles right smack in between two failures, two Christian princes who were failures, Cesare Borgia and Livarotto da Fermo, and the contrast there shows precisely what was possible in the pagan world of civic militaries and what is impossible in the Christian papal world of mercenary militaries on the one hand. And deeper than that, I think Agathocles is the prince for Machiavelli who leaves the city and comes back, unlike another famous prince of peace who leaves the city and everybody waits for him to come back and he never does. Agathocles leaves, goes to Africa, and comes back to rule, actually, making him a superior prince to Jesus Christ.
And he was senza religione, not a pagan. Thank you. You get your quick break.